The Florida Podcast Network, the voice of Florida. Welcome to episode 5 of the Florida Podcasting News Show on the Florida Podcast Network. Florida Podcasting News keeps you on the inside of Florida's podcasting industry.
On today's episode, we'll be chatting with Bruce Wawrzyniak about the intersection of sports and faith podcasting in Florida with his new show, Catholic Sports Radio. We'll tell you about an exciting new podcast conference hitting the scene and review the latest podcast consumer studies that just came out. And Tony of the Bob and Sheri Show, a nationally syndicated radio show, joins us to talk about how radio is changing in its views on podcasting.
And of course, we'll catch you up on the latest with the Florida Podcast Network and close, as always, with a final tip. This episode is brought to you by Flintstone Media. Thanks for joining us. This is Jemmy.
And this is Glenn. Welcome back to a brand new episode of the Florida Podcasting News Show.
It's episode 5, so we thought we'd take a chance right now to reintroduce ourselves to y'all and just tell you a little bit more about who we are and what we've done. So I've been in Florida now since 1982. That's right. I'm old enough to have been here since 1982. I was actually a child of the 70s for the record. But yeah, my family moved here in Miami when I was just a wee little toddler. And I grew up in Boca mostly, went to school in Boca Raton and Fort Lauderdale. And then I moved out of state for college and for law school. But Florida is home, always will be home. And I started podcasting back in 2014. I launched Curve the Cube. I also had a very short-lived show called Eggheads After Hours. I started in 2016, also ended in 2016. And then I founded Florida Podcast Network in 2017, shortly after meeting Glenn here, and we have been working on that ever since. So, yes, I also am the owner of Flintstone Media, the one who is sponsoring this episode here, and is a podcasting and website production services company. And I also organize the Palm Beach Podcasters Meetup group. So I'm saying I'm pretty well off on my podcasting career here, but Glenn, you are much longer in the tooth, so tell everybody about how long you've been.
In many ways.
How long you've been in Florida, how long you've been podcasting?
Actually, we've only been in Florida about 7 years, but I started podcasting 11 years ago with the Horse Radio Network and started with a show called the Stable Scoop Radio Show. That was our flagship show. And now we've grown it into 20 shows with tens of thousands of listeners from around the world, all talking about horses. We just passed 7,500 episodes on the network. And I think I kind of figured that out. I've hosted almost 5,000 of those.
It's unbelievable.
So
Can't you ever shut up?
I know, that's it. That's true. I was born in Pennsylvania, and I owned an acting company for a lot of years. We did 450 shows over 10 years. It was a medieval feasting acting company.
You played the king.
I did. Kind of did a Benny Hill version of a medieval feast. It was a lot of fun. And we had the same cast for 20 years, which is unheard of in the acting world. And, I host now several shows. Our most popular is Horses in the Morning, 5 days a week, an hour and a half every day, 5 days a week. And that's our most popular show, which goes to show you.
Some of the stuff y'all talk about is gross.
It does involve horse parts. And we have 2 shows here in the Florida Podcast Network, this one. And also, Jemmy and I do a fun show called Finding Florida. It's the only travel adventure show I know of its kind, actually.
Yeah.
I've never seen any in any other state either, where we travel around and we actually do a lot of things in a weekend, record them all,
no
put it through an editing nightmare.
Crazy as we are. That's why they're the only ones.
Well, and to give everybody listening to this knows about editing, that to edit an episode of that show takes me between 8 and 10 hours.
It's a big beast. It really is.
20 hours of audio, and we condense it down to less than an hour. And then we put in a lot of sound, a lot of music, and really make it tight.
Yeah.
And to do that, it goes through 2 revisions then. You listen to it, I listen to it back, and then we revise it twice more until we come down to that.
Right. And then there's the preview episodes for that show, which are completely, totally different types of production. So we really do have a lot of production experience under our belts. We've been podcasting for a number of years. So when we decided to put this show together, it's because we know so many awesome people in Florida's podcasting space. You know, I got a chance to talk on International Podcasting Day about Florida's podcasting scene a couple of years ago and all the people who are involved in that. And going to all these conferences, we just know a lot of people involved in the scene, and we wanted to talk a lot more about that. So we'll be doing that again, 1st and 15th of every month, and the one on the 15th is accompanied by a newsletter. So go to floridapodcastnews.com where you can find previous editions of said newsletter, previous episodes of this show, and also sign up to join the newsletter or to send us any information that you want to share about what you're doing in the Florida podcasting scene. And with that, we will turn now to Florida's industry news. Well, an episode or 2 ago, Glenn offered us a deep dive into what newspapers are doing around our state as far as podcasts are concerned. And you found a lot of numbers are involved with the sports side of podcasting,
Easily
right?
80% of what newspapers are doing podcast-wise is sports.
Unbelievable. Well, at Podfest recently, I was approached by our good friend, Bruce Wawrzyniak, who you may know as doing his show Now Hear This Entertainment. He's been podcasting since 2014, and he's well known in the entertainment circles for that. But he approached me because he has a new show called Catholic Sports Radio. And I thought he was the perfect person to talk about on today's show, diving into sports related podcasts in Florida and how that's such a big growing theme. And so, Bruce, welcome to the show and thank you for joining us today.
Sure. Thank you. Good to hear from you as always.
So tell us a little bit about Catholic Sports Radio, how you decided to start it. Why did you think now was the right time for you to start talking about sports in your podcasting career?
Well, I actually had the idea for it a couple of years ago and went ahead and registered the domain name for it. And then GoDaddy reminds you a year later it's going to renew.
And a year later, and a year later, and a year.
It's not so much they're taking this money from me, but this thing is sitting there, and this idea is sitting there, and I really believed in the idea. And in terms of why did I decide to do it now, Jemmy, I think it's because I saw the success that I was having with Now Hear This Entertainment. I learned, what I would have done differently if I had been starting up a podcast, and I thought, I've got this routine down pretty well, and I feel so strongly about this topic and this category that now is a good time to launch it. Everything felt ready, and I got all my ducks in a row, talked to all the people I wanted to talk to before I pressed start, and now I'm off and running with it, and I'm really thrilled with the response that it's getting.
That's fantastic.
Are you Catholic, or are you like a Baptist and doing the Catholic Sports Radio?
Lifelong Catholic.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Now, Glenn and I talk a lot about, niches. We think people should create new podcasts today that are niche based somehow, figure out some way to stand out. And when it comes to sports podcasting, there's a lot out there. And then also when it comes to faith and religious based podcasting, there's also a lot out there. So how you're finding your niche by intersecting them? Where do you see that intersection living? What's the basis of the show that creates that intersection there?
This is very niched down because I know that there are scores of sports podcasts out there, and I know that there are scores of religion and spirituality podcasts out there. But it's funny that you said, where does this live? Because my temporary tagline has been Catholic Sports Radio, located at the intersection of your faith life and your sports life. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people have scratched their head and said, tell me more. Interesting concept, because the two really don't on the outside look like they go together. But what I'm doing, and it's funny, Glenn, that you said, are you a Baptist? Doing that because the one real niche is finding guests who are Catholic. So right away, the knee-jerk reaction is for people to say, you should interview Tim Tebow, or you should interview, and they've got all these other names. And I actually had someone make a referral to me who I won't say who it was, but this was someone that all of a sudden us as podcasters, you start drooling and you go, wow, really? He's interested in doing it? And I had that difficult question. Is he Catholic? Well, he's Christian, but no, I don't think. And I had to say, I'm sorry. I had to stick to what the show is. And that's what the show is. I am interviewing Catholics in sports, be they current or former athletes, coaches, officials, administrators. And mind you, this is from the pro, amateur, and scholastic ranks. And they are talking about how they are blending their faith life with their sports life. So the other thing I've done differently is that because, as Glenn's research showed, there are so many podcasts out there talking about sports, I thought, we don't need another one where we're talking about wins and losses and statistics. So when these guests come on my show, we're not talking about wins, losses, and statistics. I just this morning interviewed a player for the New York Rangers. And the very last question I asked him was, hey, you didn't make the playoffs this year, but I still put it into a faith question. I didn't say, what do you think was wrong with the team? What do you think you need to change next season? Because they're doing that on other podcasts.
Right.
We don't.
They answered 1,000 times.
Right. I was thinking about your show a lot in terms of, podcasts is such a different platform and such a different medium than generic radio, because radio has so many more rules and it has to fit within a certain box. But with podcasts, you can talk about so many different things. And I noticed that you close every episode with a prayer. Your faith is right there, out there, front and center, no apologies. Like, this is what you believe in, and this is how you're relating it on your show. And you encourage your guests to do the same. And I think that is such a refreshing opportunity, no matter what your faith is, no matter what your subject matter is, that podcasting is providing that opportunity for us to really just explore things, no holds barred, good or bad, right? So why do you think that a podcast is the best way for you to explore that intersection?
Well, for openers, I want to say thank you, Jemmy. I appreciate the kind words. And I think that people are finding it refreshing, both from the guest side as well as from the listener side. I had Baby Joe Macy, who's a former undefeated heavyweight boxer who got to number 1 in the world, where his next fight would have been for the heavyweight championship, but he sustained a head injury that ended his career. And, that's an episode where my very first question out of the gate was, how does a devout Catholic step into the ring and pound some guy?
Yeah, that's right. Eat some guy senseless.
Right. Yeah. How do you rationalize that? And so then that, as I said, I think they're refreshed, like Glenn just mentioned. They're not being asked, here we go again. This guy's going to ask me about when I got traded or the current hit list streak that I'm on in baseball. So the guests like it. I think for the listeners, they see, here's a podcast that I can listen to, which I'm a boxing fan. Or when the episode comes out with the New York Rangers player, well, I'm a hockey fan. So they're attracted to it initially. And I think they do get to hear a different side that they're not used to. And like you said, Jemmy, that's the freedom that we have with podcasting. And if you think about that show, if you think about the Catholic Sports Radio podcast, you say, where would Bruce otherwise be able to place that show? You can't go to a sports talk station and say, hey, can I do Catholic Sports Radio on your station? They're going to say, there's the door. Same one you came in. Have a nice day.
Right,
they'll put you on Sunday morning, and all you're going to cover is the results of the local Catholic league. That's all you're going to do. Yeah.
Or you go to a Christian radio station and they say, I'm interested. But then they're going to say, wait a minute. Now are we going to have are we going to have a Methodist sports radio and the list goes on.
True. And don't you dare deny Tim Tebow if he comes knocking.
That's right. And but here's the other thing. So now you're doing it on terrestrial radio, and do you have the same ability to reach such a wide audience that we do in podcasting? So I've gone a long way to answer your question, Jemmy, but I think that's the beauty of this medium that we have.
Religion is the number 1 category of the most podcasts on iTunes, by far. And I think that's partly because almost every church puts out their Sunday sermon as a podcast. I think that probably takes up a large block of that.
Probably, yeah.
But you're able to talk and you're able to get deep in a way that you can't do in any other format. And these people you're having on have never been asked about this before, because mainstream media is certainly not going to ask them about their religion unless it's condescending. So it's probably refreshing for your guests. And let's tie it back to podcasting. Because of that, they're more likely to promote it on their social media than otherwise, because it's different.
Sure. Yeah. If they just do a typical, routine, predictable questions interview with a traditional media outlet, you're exactly right, Glenn. They're probably not going to post about that on their social media.
Because they've done 100 of them.
Exactly. I was very fortunate to get the Catholic News Service to call me and interview me over the telephone, and they wrote a feature about Catholic Sports Radio.
Oh, wow.
Yes. And then they pushed it out, and several of their member papers published that. And so that has really helped. I've gotten messages from people, some guy in Detroit, hey, I run a CYO and I found out about Catholic Sports Radio, and can we put it on our website? And so, that's really helped. But that's a big part of where I am right now, is doing interviews like I'm doing with the two of you, and anything I can to let people know. But I think that the body of Christ, the Catholic Church itself, will spread the word. And there's some great organizations that I'm connecting with that are going to help me get the word out too. And I'm very optimistic about it.
Well, thank you so much, Bruce, for taking the time to share what you're doing and your contributions to the Florida podcasting scene. You're doing such amazing work. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you both so much.
Well, that was an awesome conversation with Bruce. He is just doing so many awesome, fantastic things. He's like a trailblazer right here in Florida. And it's so great to know him and get to see him at the conferences and have him tap me on the shoulder and be like, hey, can I come on and talk about my new show? Yes, Bruce, please. He was great and had so many insightful things to say. So that was fantastic. And more of these conversations happen not just at conferences, but also at meetups that are popping up all over our state, one of which I am the organizer of. So I wanted to let everyone know that, yes, Palm Beach Podcasters is back. We have a meeting actually scheduled. Desmond and I had the conversation today. So the meeting is going to happen, save the date, Tuesday, May 7th at 6:30. So anybody in the Palm Beach County area who is new to podcasting, who's been podcasting forever, whatever, please join us. Look for more information. Watch for details at palmbeachpodcasters.com. We know the when, but we're not quite sure yet of the where, exactly of the what. But we're going to be talking about some really cool stuff and really kicking off this meetup group. So come join us, palmbeachpodcasters.com. May 7th is Tuesday night at 6:30.
Well, Jemmy and I met at a conference, actually a podcasting conference, PodFest, and there's a new conference coming out by some of our friends, and it's for the ladies. It's She Podcasts Live, the Women's Podcasting Experience, and they've been doing a fundraiser through Kickstarter for it, and they made it. They made it! It looks like it's going to happen.
We are so excited. So these are our friends, Elsie Escobar and Jessica Kupferman. So they have their podcast called She Podcasts, and it's not just a podcast, it's a whole community of women podcasters, and I'm so proud to say that I'm a member of it. I wish I was a more active member. I need to kick myself in the butt about it, but it's such a solid group of women and they're so supportive of one another. And so, so they decided to do this conference specifically for women, and it's the She Podcast Conference. And it's really exciting because they did this Kickstarter, and it was, there were no sponsors announced. There were no affiliate, any kind of support, no speakers announced yet. It was just a grassroots effort to say, we want this conference out there. And the women responded and got tickets, and the Kickstarter is now funded. And I'm so excited because let me tell you about Jessica and Elsie. These women support other podcasters generally, but specifically women like nobody's business. You hear all the time about women being cutthroat and cutting each other down. That's so not what they do. They actually gave me my first ever award back in 2017 at PodFest. I got my first, I could call myself an award-winning podcaster because of them, because they recognized my talent of being obnoxious when it comes to marketing my stuff. And I got the In Your Face Podcasting Award. And so Elsie and Jessica, congratulations to what you guys are doing. We're really looking forward to seeing what comes of this conference. So go to shepodcast.com/Kickstarter for more information about the conference, or just look them up on Facebook, and we will also provide a link in the show notes. And Glenn, you have some really interesting information to share about the latest stats.
Yeah, so the Podcast Consumer 2019 report just came out, and this is one that the Infinite Dial and Edison Research and Triton Digital do. And they've done it every year, so of course, we're both professional podcasters. We make our living doing this, so we keep an eye on this very closely. And I have to keep an eye on it. We have, I think Jennifer billed 32 sponsors last month for the Horse Radio Network. So we have to keep an eye on it for our sponsors as well.
The
yeah, exactly. We go to them and say, hey, podcasting is working or not, right?
Right.
So I keep an eye on these numbers very much. And it was very interesting this year. And they just announced this. I just watched the webinar today. It just came out like yesterday. So what it showed, I'll just give you my breakdown in case you haven't watched it. If you have, let's see if you agree. Now, Jemmy and I have not talked about this at all. So this is the first conversation we're having about this.
And I purposely didn't look, so I was super fresh.
So that's good. All right. So the audience for podcasting grew significantly in the past year. Today, 51% of Americans over 12 years old have listened to a podcast, with over 32 having listened in the past month and 22% in the past week. That's up. That's up significantly over last year.
Yeah, that's a nice number, 51. I like that number.
Which we all expected it would be, right?
Yeah.
We all expected it would be up. One of the things that was interesting, and this is kind of hard to explain, they have a statistic called the share of the ear statistic, which is of all the audio consumed, how much of it was podcasting.
Right.
And it's interesting.
How big is the slice of the pie for podcasting?
Yeah, and that includes radio, music, anything you can listen to.
Audiobooks.
Right? Audiobooks, everything. And podcasting last year was only 4%, but that was up 122%. It was less than 2% the year before.
Ooh.
So it doubled. So it's doubled and it's continuing to grow and become a much bigger part of that pie. So the key demographics also grew, and this is something that I take a look at and that we've seen on the Horse Radio Network.
Actually, hold on, wait a minute. I want to jump back to those two statistics, because what it tells me is not only, especially with the 51%, I'm like, yay, we've passed the halfway mark, but also with the 2% jump to the 4% jump, it's telling me that there is so much more room to grow. So there is so much more potential in this space. I'm so excited.
Ton more room. You're definitely right about that. And the key demographics are growing too. And one of the biggest areas of growth has been age 12 to 24. At the Horse Radio Network, our listening audience was 35 to 55. And we've seen now more seniors coming into that, but we've also seen that younger age group, those young 20s now are starting to listen to podcasts. And that's something that we hadn't personally seen before in the horse world. So it's interesting now that what these numbers are saying pretty much mirrors what I've been looking at with our network. Yeah. I'd be very curious to know what's pushing those numbers up for that demographic. It'd be very interesting. So this is interesting, too. 41% of monthly podcast listeners say they are listening to more podcasts today compared to a year ago. So those that are listening to more. That's kind of logical. You would expect that, right? But it also goes to what we're talking about. When we talk about radio or any of these other competitors coming into podcasting, sometimes they want to complain. Independent podcasters want to complain, saying they're going to swallow us. But no. They're shining a broader light. So people who maybe only heard of Serial last year, now they're listening to 2 or 3 podcasts this year. And, it is interesting that 13% said they're listening to less. And I do wonder if that's because what they were listening to went away. Well, those 13% can suck it. And they don't know. Maybe what they were listening to, the show went away and they just haven't found more. Or the shows they were listening to, they just, I don't want to listen to this anymore. And then they haven't found more. I don't know. Who knows? Streaming services are definitely playing a role in the growth. 43% of monthly podcast listeners, get this, people, this is not a number we expected. 43% of monthly podcast listeners say they've listened to a podcast on Spotify and 35% on Pandora. Because I know those 2 companies have made big pushes in the last year. Big pushes for content. For me, this is the number I push out, right, to my sponsors, is 54% of podcast consumers say they are more likely to consider the brands they hear advertised on podcasts than not on podcasts. So and only 7% said they are less likely. So for me, that's saying, hey, people who listen to podcasts are more likely to buy something that I'm promoting than if they listen to it or read it in a magazine or anyplace else.
Okay, listen up, brands and marketers and agencies. Listen up real tight.
Florida Podcast Network is available.
Well, yes, but also the reason this is true is because when listeners hear about a product on a podcast, there's much more of a personal relationship and a personal endorsement involved than, let's say, they see a commercial on some random TV show. The people who created the TV show have nothing to do with that commercial airing. And generally speaking, right, certainly with our podcasts on Horse Radio Network and Florida Podcast Network and most of the independent podcasters, when there's a product that's being advertised or something that's being shared, it's because we personally believe in it, or we're personally talking about it. So it's gonna communicate a lot more strongly to potential listeners and then potential buyers.
A couple other things that I found very interesting in this study, and then we'll move on, is that for the first time, they asked the question, how did you hear about podcasts in the first place? And if you remember on the last episode, we had done this survey with our listeners over at Horse Radio Network too. Right. And it somewhat matched, but somewhat didn't, actually. So on the Horse Radio Network side, my listeners said that actually 60% of them said they found us through a podcast search on a podcast player. So maybe they went and searched horse on a podcast player, and then they found our shows. Right.
Podcast now becoming the new Google almost.
Right. This one said, and then Google was second on mine over on Horse Radio Network. This one says, and this is interesting because they never offered the option that we did. Searching on the internet was 73%.
Yeah. And so, see, people can take that so many different ways. Does that mean Google, or does that? Yeah, I would want to see how these numbers change if you offer the option of searching on podcast. Why wasn't that an option?
I don't know why it wasn't an option.
It seems so obvious.
So the top ones were searching on the internet, social media posts, which, by the way, social media posts on our survey was down at 5%. It was very little. Recommendations from friends and family are next. Recommendations from other audio program hosts, so other podcasts, and advertisements on other audio programs. So, and then it went on and on. So yeah, those were the top 5, and I just found that interesting and was a little bit different than I had found on ours.
I'm interested. I find it interesting that recommendations found in publications was so high, because I guess that means that articles, it's translating from the written word into people interested in consuming audio. That's interesting.
So another chart that I found very interesting, and I don't believe in, very contradictory, and I don't get it. And when I watched the webinar, they talked a lot about this, is they asked for the first time what activity you do while you're listening to podcasts.
I have a feeling some people can't answer that question.
And the number one, well, it depends on what podcast. And the number one was not doing anything else, just listening. And I have never sat down and just listened. I'm always doing something else.
Something, whether it's work or dishes or driving or working out.
Cleaning poop in my case, shoveling poop.
Not his own, his horses.
Yeah, that's right. But yeah. And then the second one was doing housework and chores, which you'd expect, because another part of this study showed that most people listen at home, which makes sense. Driving, relaxing before and going to sleep, or putting you to sleep in some case. And I do that. I go to sleep to podcasts. Cooking or baking, walking. So all the things we expected them to do. So that first one, not doing anything else, completely, in my opinion, contradicts another question they asked. Is you enjoy listening to podcasts because why? And the top answer was you can do other things while listening. So I don't know.
So apparently people like the option of being able to do other things, but they're not actually.
I don't know. It's what we always said is what I say to my advertisers is people listen while they're doing something else. It's one of the advantages over video. And magazine.
I'm still perplexed. Who is listening to a podcast and doing nothing else?
Nobody.
Who are these two?
Well, unless
if you're doing that, write me at Jemmy at FloridaPodcastNetwork.com.
You sit on the couch and listen to a podcast with nothing else going on. I don't know anybody that does. I don't know anybody that does.
Unless you're editing said podcast. I don't get it.
So now this was very interesting for us as podcasters, and we need to pay attention to, is the reasons for listening to podcasts and then the reasons that people don't listen to podcasts.
This is what we need to tackle.
Yeah, so here's the two that I thought were most interesting. Reasons for listening to podcasts, the number one answer was to learn new things, and then closely behind that was to be entertained. And, one of the quotes that I always use and that Jemmy and I have used on stage at podcasting conferences is entertainment first, education second. That they have to be entertained somewhat to be educated. And this they're neck and neck here within a margin of error, says that. It says that right there. It says they want to be entertained, but they also want to learn something. Mm-hmm. So those two go hand in hand. The next one was to stay up with latest topics, to relax, to feel inspired, to escape, and for companionship. And for those people,
Aww.
I feel, yes. Really
Sleep With Me podcast is just for you.
They all listen to that. So if they're listening to me for companionship, God bless them. I'll send the money for help. So I don't know. To learn new things and be entertained kind of backs up what we've been saying all along.
It does. And I think these numbers about why non-listeners aren't listening to podcasts
why don't you do those?
Is shocking. So this is what we really need to do a better job of doing somehow, of tackling is. So number one on the list is you don't really know how to find a podcast. And then the number two right behind is you're not sure how to listen to a podcast, which they're very similar. So we need to do a lot more. And I'm not exactly sure how we do that, because we can say that on our shows as much as we want. But if that's the issue, that we're speaking to an empty room as far as how to find a podcast, because they're not listening to one to hear the answer. So,
well, and I think,
how do we do that? We got to talk about in other ways.
And I think we're going to talk about that with Tony, who's coming up from the radio side. He's on the radio side of things. And I think that's one of the questions I want to address with him is how is that happening in other ways? So we'll find out.
Right.
But I do think and they talked about this on the webinar, we have to get outside our bubble. We can't just keep advertising. You're right. We can't keep talking to people who already know about podcasts. We got to get to the ones who don't.
It's true.
And that involves advertising outside of our sphere of podcast listeners.
You're right.
You don't understand what a podcast is. That's all the education, right? It's still the same thing. I thought this one was interesting. You don't understand the difference between a podcast and a radio show. A lot of people think that podcasting is just radio online, and that's partly our fault, because the early pioneers in this, we said we were online radio so people could get what it was. So we kind of shot ourselves in the foot with that.
Horse Radio Network. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, exactly.
But you know what? Going back to the whole thing about how to find a podcast, how to listen to a podcast, that goes back to something you've been pushing since forever, which is having your own app for your show, because it is still a foreign concept a lot of times for people to understand what a podcast app is or where to find a podcast online, But to tell them, go into your app store and search for this name and have an app come up that then plays all the shows and all the episodes there, it can help bridge that gap. So it's a recommendation for people. If you don't yet have an app for your show, create one. Maybe that's the way to bridge that gap for people learning how to listen.
And if you want to see the complete webinar, which if you're really into this stuff like Jemmy and I are, go and just search for the Podcast Consumer 2019, and it'll bring it up. The Infinite Dial 2019 is who did the webinar, and they went into great detail about all of this. About an hour long, and it was absolutely fascinating. So I don't know if you're as fascinated as we are, but give it a try.
I'm fascinated by how much respect podcasting is getting. We're being studied. Yes. There's demographics being done. There's statistics and reports.
We're growing up. We're adolescents now.
I love it.
Speaking of growing up, I want to play you a clip. We had an opportunity to talk to Tony, who is a partner in Now Media. And Now Media is a syndication company that deals with the Bob and Sheri Show, and I think a couple of others. And that's a nationally syndicated show with over 1 million listeners in 100 markets. And it's, by the way, my favorite radio show and also my favorite podcast. So he's been keeping, and I met him a couple years ago at Podcast Movement.
Yeah.
And we, we've been keeping in touch ever since then. He's kind of my inside guy in the radio side. And one of the things that all of us are curious about is how radio is getting into podcasting, what effect that's going to have on us. And we had an opportunity, Gemma and I, to chat with him. And this was such a good conversation. It went almost an hour.
We did not hit that stop button. It was so good. It was so
great.
Good.
And it's very informative for those of you who even care about that or are thinking about that. This was very inside baseball.
It was. And we talked about podcasting and radio from so many different angles. We talked about the advertising side, the content creation side, syndications, whether radio stations are picking up independent podcasts, so many different angles in that episode, in that conversation, that, what you're going to hear is just one little clip of that.
Yeah, I picked out one clip, and then in about a week, we're going to put out a special episode of Florida Podcast News, this show, with the entire interview, because we can't do it justice by taking clips out of it here. It was that good.
It was.
So we'll be doing that in about a week. We'll put out a special episode with just Tony and the whole entire interview, and I think you're going to love the backstory behind radio and podcasting. But this is what he had to say on everybody's biggest concern. So if coming from the radio side, where do you see independent podcasters fitting in after radio is forced to dive full steam into podcasting because of sponsorship, because of media buyers? Where do you see the independent podcasters living? How do you see that all playing out?
I think there's a great opportunity.
Okay.
I don't see it being, I don't see it being a problem at all. And the reason that I don't see it being a problem at all is because radio is so corporate. And for people who produce podcasts such as yourself that don't necessarily fall into a box or fall into let me put it this way, a big enough box.
Right.
They're going to want scale. They're going to want size, because that's the DNA, right? Radio's DNA, they don't call it broadcasting for no reason. The radio's DNA is mass audience, mass audience, mass audience, mass audience. What the folks who are advertising now in podcasts, which is mostly direct response guys, what they know is that it's okay if they can buy a show that only has a couple of thousand downloads a month, and I know that number's getting a little higher, but if they can buy a show with a relatively small audience that also helps them sell razor blades, meal kit deliveries, mattresses, socks, flowers, what have you, they don't care because they sold product. I don't think broadcasters understand that. I think broadcasters, we're used to, hey, we have the country countdown. It's on 400 radio stations. We have, hey, it's the blah, blah, blah conservative talk show. He's got 4.6 million listeners. I think that's where, and I think that and I think for independent podcasters, right? I think for independent podcasters, I think that it's going to be, it'll be two different businesses almost. It'll be the podcast ones of the world who are trying to get big celebrities because they can use the names of the big celebrities to try to pull big numbers, whether or not the content's any good.
And it'll be...
So I think there's a huge opportunity.
Yeah. And there'll still be me out there with the Horse Radio Network owning that world.
Yeah, and we can almost liken it to,
right.
This just occurred to me, we can almost liken it to, broadcast television versus YouTube. YouTube's not going anywhere. And even though broadcast television was it is here first and everything else, it's the big kahuna for entertainment. YouTube is still paving the way, and independent content creators are still doing really awesome things on that platform. And I think if radio wants to, continue to cast a big net and get into the podcasting business, all it's going to do is get a bigger spotlight on all of the audio entertainment that's out there, including independent podcasting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely true. And I think that, if, at least in the short term, if terrestrial broadcasters shine a light on the podcast world in general, that's good for everybody.
Flintstone Media has been the digital bedrock of several Florida brands and businesses, serving as a highly resourceful website and podcast production house since 2010. Ready to be seen? Flintstone Media has crafted the online presence for dozens of brands. In creating an intelligently built website that acts as your business's beacon, Flintstone Media will craft solid and attractive content to control your brand's message, collect visitor data, and showcase what you have to offer. Ready to be heard? Work with a leader in Florida's podcasting industry and add a podcast to your brand's content offerings. From setup through recording and distribution, Jemmy will lend her experience producing over 500 episodes and make the process of creating your show simple and easy for you. Visit flintstonemedia.com for website and podcast samples and to ignite your digital presence. That's flintstonemedia.com.
Alrighty, to catch you up on the latest with Florida Podcast Network, I want to let you know about something we put together. We love sharing all of this knowledge that we have accumulated over the years. And Glenn and I have also had the honor of speaking and doing various public speaking engagements, different conferences and whatnot. So one thing we've done is try to collect some of that video and then clip it out into some usable tips. So if you go to floridapodcastnetwork.com/videos, you'll find short clips of us at PodFest, at the Hispanic Radio Conference, the full clips of us from International Podcast Day, some video from Podcast Movement, just of us sharing our experiences and our knowledge of podcasting. So floridapodcastnetwork.com/videos for all those tips, especially on geolocal podcasting. And also, the reason that we collected and clipped those out is because I needed them. And why? I needed them because we were submitting ourselves to speak at a huge conference coming up in the end of fall, and we're very excited. We're not telling you any details yet because we are hoping to be picked, but we will let you know if that happens and what those details are. So please, everybody, as vague as this is, keep your fingers crossed and your prayer palms together because this would be massive for us. And third on the list is I just want to let y'all know about the recent episodes that we've released. So Beach Talk Radio, they hit their 50th episode. We are so excited. Congratulations to Ed and Kim Ryan. They do their show every Saturday live from Fort Myers Beach at Pete's Timeout, and they're awesome. And this episode talked about fishing tournaments for autism, boat races, and a really funny and hilarious and kind of awkward conversation at the end about man boobs.
Well, I see enough of those at the beach.
Oh, that's what sparked it. And then Suzanne Boyd.
And can I just throw in, we're going to be doing the show with them.
Yes.
We're going to be doing our Finding Florida show with them in May. We're going to be there.
We are. So Freedom RV is helping us out. We are going to be taking one of their RVs and showing off the RV camping life. And we're going to be going from Venice and through Punta Gorda and then hitting up our friends in Fort Myers Beach. And we're going to be hanging out with them on their show. I think it's going to be Saturday. I want to say the date is the 18th of May.
Yes,
so 9 a.m.
Yep.
You can see us on Facebook Live with them. And most recently, Finding Florida did a festival blitz. We hit the air show, the Sun and Fun air show. You did, Glenn, in Lakeland. Yep. Together, we did the Hatsumi Fair, which is a Japanese festival down here by me in Murakami. And I will be checking out the Cajun Fest. You guys, if you listen to Finding Florida, you know how I feel about crawfish. I'm going to be eating some at Cajun Fest. And I also wanted to take a moment to wish a very special birthday to my little friend Izzy of Reporting Live Podcast. She turned 11 as of yesterday for the recording of the show. So happy birthday to you, Izzy. Next time I see you, I have to bring you a roll of quarters. And if you want to know why, listen to episode 3 of Reporting Live Podcast. And with that, we'll give you our final tip.
So I was on the Facebook pages, and this question came up a couple of times, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about Alphonic. If you don't know what Alphonic is a service that you upload once you've edited your file, your MP3 file for your show, you upload it to Alphonic, and it inserts metadata, pictures, titles, things like that into your audio file, but it also levelates it and takes out hums and hisses. It does a lot of back-end work for you. So, for example, when we produce our episodes, we don't try and level the sound at all. We just
do a little. Like we make sure that the voices and with the music beds underneath, the music bed doesn't overpower it.
Right.
But we only take it like 10% of the work.
Yes,
and then we let the rest.
Auphonic is a godsend for people who are wondering whether they should pay for it. And by the way, Auphonic's very affordable because it only charges you. It only charges you by the minute for the size of your show. So if your show's a half an hour, you're only getting charged a half an hour's worth. It's not a flat fee that you pay regardless of how much you use. You only get charged for what you use. And I think there's a certain free plan too that you can do so much with. But we use it all the time. We use it every episode we do. The neat part about Auphonic is you can have it set up to automatically then ship the file to Libsyn, or in my case, you can have it set up to ship to a database. You can have it FTP'd into your website. And you can have copies sent to you of the final file. So I have my drive, my Google Drive. I get copies of every one that's done. So I have a copy of every finished file on Google Drive automatically.
So convenient. And not only that, you can set up templates. So literally every show in Horse Radio Network, every show in Florida Podcast Network has a template that already has the show art, the title, the name, like all that stuff in there. So you just have to change like the episode specific stuff. It is so convenient. And we talked a lot, I think within the first episode or two, about how important SEO is, and inserting metadata into your MP3 files, your finished audio files helps with that. So Auphonic makes it super, super easy.
It really does. We would spend a half an hour more on every episode we did if it wasn't for Auphonic.
True story.
At least.
True story.
At least.
It adds in everything you want to add and takes in all the stuff you want to take out.
And it does I know a lot of people use Levelator. I think that Auphonic actually does a little bit better job because it also cleans up hisses and and that kind of thing. So I think Auphonic actually does a little bit better job than Levelator as well. It's worth the money. If you have a weekly show that's a half an hour to an hour, it's not going to cost you that much. It is worth it. Give it a try and check it out. I do know that you can test it for free, so give it a try anyway. I highly recommend it. I know Jemmy does too.
I do. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this episode 5 of the Florida Podcasting News Show. We love your feedback. You know, we're now 5 episodes deep. There's plenty now for you to let us know what was great, what really sucks, what you want to have us change. So please join our Facebook group. It's exclusively for super fans of our shows. So it's called FPN Insiders. It's right there on Facebook. Just search for it and you can leave us comments, or you can also email us, Jemmy, Jaime at FloridaPodcastNetwork.com, or Glenn, GLENN at FloridaPodcastNetwork.com. But if you can join us in that FPN Insiders group on Facebook, that would be fantastic. And for updates on this and other shows, you can go to FloridaPodcastingNews.com. We have all of our show notes with our links and the email for Tony, the Walmart of whatever he said.
Right now, and I want to remind everybody, in a week, we're going to have that special episode with the whole interview with Tony.
For sure. So, so we are so excited for everything that we have coming through the pipeline, and you can keep up with all of it at FloridaPodcastingNews.com.
And many thanks this week to our sponsor, Flintstone Media. If you're looking for a podcast production company or work on a website or building a website for your podcast, which you should have for SEO purposes, you can contact Flintstone Media.
And you may be familiar with the owner of that company because it's me.
You might hear her voice. And be sure to visit all the great shows on the Florida Podcast Network. You can find them at FloridaPodcastNetwork.com. Until next time, thanks for hanging out on the inside of Florida's podcasting industry.